It's not enough just to have the right stuff. You gotta know where you're fallible. Do your reps, take the right steps, gotta adapt and become malleable. That's the only way to amp up your play and become a card slinger to the maximal.
It only matters if it ladders. Comment below as we walk through Week 11 of Foundation Standard. Well, Dimir Bounce tops our tier list this week. Folks, we looked at 9 major tournaments and 72 top 8 spots. Of those, Dimir Bounce snagged 11 top 8s and 2 trophies. That's above a 15% meta share for this archetype, and as you can see by our next deck, it is even more impressive than that, Max.
Dimir Aggro came in second with 11 top 8s and 2 trophies of its own. As we approach the final weekend of Foundation Standard, all the dice are really coming up Dimir, and Kaido's domination just continues.
Gruul Aggro came in third with 10 top 8s and 2 trophies. The archetype continues to evolve to handle a Dimir and Pixie heavy meta, but retains its core as the 12 mice package has solidified Max into a pillar of the format.
Oh man, Darth, Esper Pixie rounds out our tier 1, 10 top 8s, 1 trophy of its own. Yet again, we have a week where 2 of the top 4 decks are defined by bounce.
So if you count up the 9 tournaments we analyzed, and 7 out of those 9 were taken down by tier 1 archetypes, 42 out of 72 total top 8 slots all go to tier 1 archetypes. 2 out of 4 decks are Dimir, 2 out of 4 decks utilized a heavy bounce strategy. That is tier 1 dominance to end the season, and leaves most of us feeling like the format is pretty close to solved.
But fear not, we've got Fast and the Furious, Aetherdrift coming in hot in less than 2 weeks, and so the metagame puzzle will shift once more as we see how the new set affects the top of the heat.
Moving into Tier 2, Mono Red took 5th place with 5 top 8s and a single trophy. It's a late season surge for yield, get 'em dead red, and a quick side note that this also places 2 mice-based Red Aggro decks in the top 5 decks in our tier list.
Oh yeah, in much happier news, I can report Golgari Midrange finally managed to push through and win a trophy, placing 2 other pilots in top 8s as well. We have said for weeks that this archetype felt like a trap, but we'll eat some crow on this one and simply congratulate the brave soul who slogged through the meta with good old Llanowar Elves and friends.
Speaking of green-based mid-range, Selesnya Cage came out swinging with 5 top 8s of its own, the first of which was mine last Friday, and 2 of which were with my copy of the deck in the hands of a good friend. Now, gang, I know this isn't a tier 1 archetype at its core, but the positioning it had against the field last week was strong, and there's a reason that I had it on my segment for ahead of the curve last week.
Yeah, you are certainly validated with that choice. Omni Combo rounds out our tier list with 2 top 8s, no trophy. Honestly, it's of several tier 1.5 decks that works until the hate comes for it. And with prior weeks leading to breakout performances, we knew the meta would alter to address it, as shown here.
Over in Brewer's Corner, I'll be highlighting the latest update for Bant Toxic and a spicy Dimir control build.
And I'll be showcasing a whole new take on Rakdos Lizards, along with Gruul Dinos? But first, let's kick off the tier 1 archetypes by taking a closer look at Dimir Bounce.
Indy Whitaker smashed through a 30-player RCQ in Iowa on Friday night with Dimir Bounce, taking out yours truly in the top 8 match before going on to win the whole thing. And quick shout out to you, bud. Those were some great games. Now, let's take a look at this build because this is actually my favorite build that I've seen for Dimir Bounce yet. This is balanced as hell. There are 3-1 split of nowhere to run in Witch's Vanity in the main. I think that's fantastic right now. You know, you're seeing Gruul decks play Innkeeper's Talent. You're seeing people try to make creatures big enough that nowhere to run isn't as effective. So having that split basically says, we don't care how big your Manifold Mouse is. We're killing it with Witch's Vanity, and we've got another one in the sideboard just to make sure. So it's really balanced on that front. I also like that we're in on let's play the 3 Curiosities, let's play the 3 Kaidos. That's solidified into the engine of this deck, and it's done a great job, obviously. It's honestly, to me, this is the best of every world of Dimir. I can see why Dimir Bounce is getting reps over Dimir Tempo. You just get to play a better mid-game and late game when you have this Town 8 big enough and Storm Chaser's Talent to loop. And you also have some very aggressive starts with Storm Chaser's Talent into like Fear of Isolation.
Yeah, we've certainly seen like just tiny evolutions, tiny adaptations week to week for this archetype. You think this is the best deck, the best iteration of the deck that we're going to get until the new set, or are there cards that are being overlooked that we could be sleeping on right now?
I think this is the most balanced deck that we're going to see. Before you get to the new set, I really think this build is incredibly balanced. It's got pieces to deal with aggro. It's got pieces to deal with the mirror. It clearly knows that it wants to be beating Dimir Bounce, Dimir Tempo, Gruul, Mono Red, Esper Pixie, and it's built that way in the main. But you get into the board, and it has plans for decks like Invoke and Cage, clearly, as it took me out as well. So I think it's really well balanced right now, given where the meta is. Obviously, slots are going to shift week to week; they always do. But if we're looking at where the meta was last weekend, this was perfectly positioned.
Yeah, I have to agree with you there. And despite all those small adaptations, they're really moving away from just being another copy of Dimir Tempo. These have really become two distinct archetypes, even though they're in the same colors. But let's switch over to that and talk about Dimir Tempo.
I apologize if I butcher this name. Paulo Achacozo took down a 37-player RCQ in the Philippines this past Saturday with Dimir Tempo, reminding the world that you don't have to bounce everything, just out-tempo your opponent. So looking at this build, I like that we're on Urtai in the main instead of Shelly. I think that's appropriate right now. Shelly just gets bounced, gets killed on impact. It has no ETB. It's not well positioned unless you're playing against mice. And even the mice decks, I mean, Mono Red's running like 3 Witchstalker Frenzies in the main, and everybody else is starting to follow suit. So do you really want to play a Shelly into a removal spell plus tempo? I don't think so. Urtai, on the other hand, amazing ETB, not a card they want to bounce. Provides a little bit more strength against the go big plans, the ramp plans, the domain plans, and you need that. And that's what I'm seeing when I look at this as well. You're seeing the Spell Stutter, the Phantom Interference, Urtai, that's 3 counters in the main. Tishana's acts as a couple of extra potential pseudo counters. But you've also got the Preachers in the main. And Preacher is well positioned against Bounce, it's well positioned against Gruul. It's sitting there with a 4-bet saying, nowhere to run, not going to kill me. Witch's Vanity, not going to kill me. You better have a Witchstalker Frenzy on impact, otherwise it's going to be probably a 2-for-1 and a turn to get through it for a red deck.
Yeah, we've talked already about how Preacher's just so well positioned because of the 4 toughness. So we're seeing 8 fairies in the main now for this deck. Does that mean we should go with more copies of Spell Stutter, perhaps?
It's possible. It's possible. I like the versatility of that very first copy of Phantasmal Interference. There are many board states where having a 2/2 flyer is beneficial, and where having a counterspell that counters something for 2 no longer matters. So I like that there's a split here, and I think that's where you get when you get to the end of the format, Max, when you get to that solution. Is the slots tighten up and you're like, okay, I want to see one of this effect, but no more than one, because then it's redundant and not in a good way. And that's what I see when I look at Spell Stutter and when I look at Phantasmal Interference. That 1/1 split makes a lot of sense. Either of those cards, extremely powerful on their own. Multiples of those cards, not necessarily where you want to be, because there's not enough flexibility to adapt to the game plan for your opponent.
Yeah, it takes some versatility and some nuance in piloting to be able to see, what you want as a one of. It's very easy to just go hard on the cards that you think are great. But yeah, it seems like this deck is finely tuned, and I don't know how many more adaptations we're going to see before the new set, maybe none. But let's shift over to a deck that's had a target on its back the whole time, Gruul Aggro.
MJ23 won a 40-player MTGO challenge on Friday with Gruul Aggro, continuing the deck's evolution in a world of blue. So let's dive in. What you're going to see here, as predicted, Paw Patch recruits a 3 of, Innkeeper's Talent's a 3 of, Sentinel the Nameless City is now in the main as a 2 of, and you're still seeing those questing druids. So the green splash here is really there to give you a little bit more in terms of points against Pixie, Dimir Bounce, Dimir Tempo. You like the Paw Patch recruits because they let your little creatures trade favorably as the game goes on and scale outside of nowhere to run. Innkeeper's Talent, similar thing. Nothing scarier than all those double striking mice when you start putting counters on them. Sentinel of the Nameless City. This I love with the fact that they have the torch, the towers in the main. It supercharges the torches by giving you all those map tokens, which you can just bargain away to kill Enduring Curiosity permanently. So I think that this is going to become a mainstay as long as we're seeing bounce decks and pixie decks, because Nowhere to Run doesn't kill it. You can't bounce it favorably, and it makes those torch the towers supercharged.
Absolutely. You stole my thunder there. I honestly, I have to say, I did recruit Paw Patch Recruit over Swift Spear. I think it's a much more impactful card. Definitely a good choice, I think, for where the meta is right now. And you just said Sentinel fits in really well, especially with Torch the Tower. Is this going right along with the Get 'em Dead game plan, or is the deck hedging way too much to try to be a bit more defensive? What do you think?
I think it's realizing that you don't have to be aggressive with the shell that you have. What you have is a mice package that scales over time, yet has to be answered on impact. And when you have that ability in aggro, then what you surround it with can be protection, like Paw Patch Recruit and Innkeeper's Talent. It can be scaling, like Innkeeper's Talent and the map tokens from Sentinel. But what you're really trying to do is find the cards that interact most favorably against your problematic matchups. And right now, with Bounce and Pixie both in Tier 1 land, a huge part of this, and honestly with Dimir Tempo also being in Tier 1 land, you're just seeing black-based mid-range full of removal. So the Paw Patch Recruits come in to mitigate that. You know, you've got 2-for-1s there that also give +1/+1 counters elsewhere. You're seeing Sentinel come in because all these nowhere to run decks and Witch's Vanities, they don't hit it. So you have something that plays offense, plays defense, and has a chonky butt for the mirror match where they're trying to swing through. I think it's just positioning more than anything. It's not that these cards are fantastic on their own. It's that they provide the context you need for Red to have longevity in matchups where it cannot just win quickly anymore because everyone's ready for the Swift Spear versions.
That's a really good answer. I think you're absolutely correct on that. And again, I'm going to point to a little bit of nuance in piloting to be able to know, when you need to shift to your weaker matchups and play those cards when you have a decent enough game plan that you can kind of, slot in some other things. So yeah, I love the way this has turned out towards the end of Foundations. I think it's well positioned with the Sentinel especially. Okay, so let's talk about the deck that keeps getting brought up even when we talk about other decks because it's just been so dominant. Esper Pixie.
Katuo079595 snagged a trophy from Saturday's 44-player MTGO challenge with Esper Pixies, taking down Bant Toxic in the finals of all decks. Let's take a look at how this one's positioned, though. You've got the return of Spiteful Hexmage. It's back. Didn't expect to see this, honestly. A huge part of why this card was around was because you were able to have a more aggressive start that then turned into Sheltered by Ghost, turning that into a 4/2 with lifelink, right? And Sheltered by Ghost, it's gone. It's not in the list anymore. But I think that that very quick start, and let's remember that Cursed Roll token triggers Optimistic Scavenger, okay? Can get returned with Pixie and Fear of Isolation. So you can put a lot of power on the board quickly, and I think that's why the Hexmage is back. Because it's saying, okay, Dimir Bounce actually has the ability to outgrind us. We have to go faster. So it's doing that. The other piece, and the spiciest piece of this list, are the 2 temporary lockdowns in the sideboard. Pixie players are trying this card out, and it is really good when you have all the ETBs when it blows up. So you can set up these game states where you are playing lockdown, exiling half your board, half of their board, and then you just bounce it on back, and you get all your ETB triggers. So do they. But, if you're against Gruul, that just removed all the counters that they put on everything. So it's kind of a reset for all the Innkeeper's Talent targets, while simultaneously giving you possibly, a bunch of nowhere to runs, Hopeless Nightmares, and Tithing Blade activations.
Yeah, the deck is very dominant, and it has been for a while now. So, we talk about beating it in other matchups with other decks. Are there enough cards for these other decks to really deter people from playing Esper Pixie, or is Esper Pixie going to continue to be dominant, despite the Sentinels and Gruul, different effects that ETB?
I think Pixie's actually easier to answer than Dimir Bounce. Dimir Bounce has multiple game plans you can go into, and each of those game plans is very strong. Esper Pixie really is aggressive. It's the mono red of Esper. You know what I mean? Like, it is trying to push hard and fast and get as much value as possible from the bounce effects. Whereas Dimir Bounce is like, well, we've got Curiosities, we've got Kaidos, we've got more longevity. Pixie goes, no, these creatures have to stick, and they have to carry us. So I think it's more aggressive and linear, and therefore probably a little bit easier to answer, but requires more overt hedging than Dimir does necessarily.
Okay, that makes a ton of sense. Definitely. That does it for all our Tier 1 archetypes. Let's go ahead and talk a little bit about Tier 2, and I'll start with Mono Red Aggro. So Sarlanga won a 39-player MTGO challenge on Thursday last week with Mono Red, really aiming for pure aggression here rather than a more nuanced grind, like you saw with Gruul, for example. But let's see what they did here with this deck. Main board basically unchanged, not too much to report. We are looking at 4 Sunspine Links in the sideboard to punish, the complex mana bases, the bounce decks, that sort of thing. I am intrigued by the 1 Pyroclasm. It's kind of a non-bow, right? Because, your Manifold, your Hired Claws, rest of your creatures can get around it, but there's some tension with those creatures being in the deck. They are still on the 4 Screaming Nemesis, and I love that they haven't gotten off that card. In mirrors, it honestly, in my experience, can come down to which players gets theirs out first. It makes a phenomenal blocker, a phenomenal attacker. It's a very situational card. So I definitely love sticking with the 4 Screaming Nemesis here. I think that's a big highlight in the deck. Other than that, I think there are some adjustments that could be made in the sideboard. But other than that, I think the main being unchanged is a testament to the fact that this is still a get 'em dead red game plan.
So, Max, I look at this and I'm noting those 3 Twisted Fealties just sitting in the sideboard. Do we need those right now? I haven't seen demons run around or anything super mid-rangey in a while. Do you want something else instead?
I think you're highlighting a little bit of a chink in the armor in the sideboard here. I don't think we're in the right place in the meta for Twisted Fealty. That card anticipates the mid-range matchups, Sheldrids, your big creatures. That's just not where the meta is right now. I do agree that we probably want the full set of Lithos like we typically plan for when we talk about red. There's just too many things that you want to get rid of. Shelter by Ghost is still out there. A lot of white-based decks are still out there. However, I also like 2 more Pyroclasms. Having 3 in the sideboard might be ideal. Now, I know there's tension with some of the low-end curve creatures, but there's this interesting play. If you have Nemesis on the board, you cast Pyroclasm, that can extend the damage to kill an even bigger creature that doesn't get killed by, has 2 toughness. Or you can just hit the player with it. So it's an interesting interaction. Nemesis sort of makes that card a little bit more intriguing. So that'd be something I'd be willing to try out, is 3 Pyroclasms with the 4 Screaming Nemesis.
I especially love this idea of the Pyroclasm into Nemesis if your opponent went into Knight Errant of Eos, because that's the final 2 points off Nemesis to kill the Knight along with the rest of the board. So it is a full one-sided Wrath effect there, and that is insane against Convoke. So I'm with you, Max.
I hadn't thought about that.
Honestly, I'd forgotten about that possibility until you brought up like Pyro on Nemesis, and I'm like, oh shit, we kill Knight. Like we actually blow up the 4/4 too, and then just swing through. Oh god, that's fantastic. But
yeah, we've been talking about the 4 toughness butts all along, and it definitely hits those. So yeah, I mean, it's a way for Mono Red to get around those cards. Yeah.
Oh man, speaking of decks with way too many 4 toughness butts, let's look at Golgari Midrange.
Tunak claimed a trophy for Golgari last Tuesday, taking down Dimir Tempo in the finals. Congratulations on that. But let's examine what's changed about this deck and how they pushed through. Now, last week I issued a challenge, Golgari pilots, tune your deck to respond and be more interactive with the meta, and I feel like we have that here. 4 Preachers, 3 Sentinels. We've already talked about how those are good against the bounce decks and the mono red decks. We've got a couple copies of Thrun. I mean, this is just great against the meta right now. Nobody's playing green other than Golgari, really. Maybe a little bit of Domain, but Thrun is still just a great main board against a lot of the decks in Tier 1. You've got 14 removal spells now in the main, which is almost like 25% of the deck, which that includes 4 ways to blow up enchantments, which I think is a must right now, and 4 ways to blow up planeswalkers in the main, which is also a must right now, especially with Kaido running around. So we're pre-hedged here for Bounce, Tempo, Gruul, Mono Red, Pixie, and I think that's really the best positioning this deck could take. It does get wrecked by Domain still. That's been a classic chink in the armor for Golgari Midrange, but that's a fair price to pay for being able to take down the aggressive metagame.
So we talked about how this is pre-hedged for red, this is pre-hedged for bounce, pixie, etc. Max. At this point, do we want to hedge even farther? Do we want Obstinate Baloth in the main? Do we just say screw it to Shelly and go all in on Baloth?
I think that's a good idea. I think you take those 2 Baloth in the sideboard and you swap it for the 2 Shellys in the main, and you only bring in the Shelly if you're not playing against that matchup where it's optimal. Considering all the balance going around, Shelly never gets to do her thing on the opponent's draw step. Baloth is a better fit. So yeah, I think you make that swap right now.
That's fair. And now for another deck that loves Obstinate Baloth off the board, Selesnya Cage.
So Jack Nicholls made back-to-back semifinal RCQ finishes with Cage this past weekend. Let's take a look at this list. There are 4 total Shelter by Ghosts in the deck, but only 1 in the main. Now, it is a tempo swing that we need against decks like Gruul and Mono Red, but it's poorly positioned against the bounce decks with nowhere to run. So having 1 is a good little nuance, a good level in the main, in my opinion. 3 Baloths in the sideboard. overperforming against Bounce and Red. Sticking a Shelter by Ghost on one of these is a 9-point life swing across 2 turns. Hard to catch up when that happens for the opponent. 3 Enduring Innocence in the sideboard. I want to say Riktus overcorrected here. Got salty probably for losing a grinding match to Dimir Bounce in the top 8. We likely only need 1 to 2 copies at most, if that. And I think Riktus is going to agree with that. I like Tender Wild Guide, full set. The card dodges Split Up really well, and it also helps us ramp to Overlord on turn 3, Virtue on turns 3 or 4. So I really like that card for this deck. And I generally like where this deck is positioned, but these past few weeks we're seeing some tech against it with the temporary lockdown, so that is presenting a problem.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and agree with you. 3 Enduring Innocence was incorrect, audience. That's on me. I'm super tilted after losing the top 8 to the Dimir Bounce list you saw earlier, and just said, screw it, we're never losing to the grind again. We're just playing Enduring Innocence in a deck filled with tokens that will trigger it. Still don't know how viable that is. Need to do more testing. I doubt 3 is correct. It's probably like a 1 or a 2 of at most. We'll find out. Time will tell. But looking at this list, Max, we're seeing Esper Pixie play Temporary Lockdown now as their tech for just dealing with some of these decks. How screwed are we if Esper Pixie's going to pick that up?
This might be why you want at least a couple copies of Enduring Innocence, right, to get some kind of draw, some card advantage before it happens. But yeah, I'm just gonna say flat out, this is a problem for Cage decks, especially when they play it optimally. They actually destroy it or bounce it and get those ETBs all over again. That's really bad. It does get around Pop Hatch Recruit, which was kind of the tech against interactive decks. Aven Interrupter feels pretty good here as a 3-drop, for this matchup. It will stall your opponent for another turn, but I still worry about having all the tokens, all the low-end creatures, removed. Them being able to repeat Nowhere to Runs, Tithing Blades, when they bounce their own lockdown. It kind of negates the 2-for-1 value angle we were going for with this deck, so gonna have to build around it, find another way, honestly.
That's fair. I will say that this past week, that deck was just straight fire for us. I think we went, was it almost, I think it was 12-1 in the Swiss, and then all the other losses were in the top 8 or top 4, usually against matchups we did not prepare for. We did not get to play against a whole lot of Dimir Bounce. I did, obviously lost, obviously got salty, but outside of that, deck was a lot of fun. But speaking of decks that are a ton of fun, Omniscience Combo, let's do it.
Sticking around tier 2, we have Omniscience Combo, and we're back in Iowa. We'd love to go there. A lot of good pro Magic players in Iowa. Luke Shealy made it to the semifinals of Friday's RCQ with this deck. The changes I can report: this town ain't big enough in the sideboard. I think they see the advantage of that card. We're down to only 1 Grain Abolisher in the sideboard now as an exchange. I guess the card kind of underperformed a little bit. Now, what fascinates me, though, what intrigues, is the 2 copies of Minor Misstep in the sideboard. I think this is very interesting tech against, the bounce decks, all those 1-mana cards that they love to cast. So very cool. I might like to see more copies depending on how dominant, and I mean, they are dominant. Bounce and Esper Pixie are very dominant decks right now. So maybe more copies, maybe some in the main. I don't know. I don't know if the deck has room. It certainly knows what it wants to do. And when it pulls it off, I've been beat by it a couple times. And the first time I got beat by Omni Combo, I was like, what the heck? What is their win con? And we got some comments last week and the week prior, and in the comments about, what is this deck's win con? And it's an interesting deck that still kind of comes out of nowhere, even 3 weeks in being in the meta.
Fair. And I mean, you figure out what that win con is the moment it beats you the first time, and you go, oh, okay. I guess they get carpal tunnel, and I get to learn a lesson. Fantastic.
Yep.
But looking at it, Max, they're playing Temporary Lockdown, 3 of in the sideboard. Is this indicative of a trend across the meta to you?
I want to say it sort of is, right? Wanting to respond to the low curve, aggressive matchups that tend to beat this deck before it goes off. However, you have to note it's not great against Pixie, right? Pixie can make it an effective win for them in terms of value gain. It does seem effective against Cage, Mono Red, but the Dimir and Esper bounce decks that are in tier 1 are not really bothered by it at all. In fact, right, they get more value when they bounce it themselves. So it's an interesting play, but yeah, don't bring that in against the top 2 decks right now.
Yeah, that's fair. It's one of those where I also looked at it, I'm like, yeah, it's great against bounce. Wait. Wait, is this a trap? This feels like a trap. But Mono Red Gruul, I could see it putting in some work there, just clearing out the first wave of things while you try to get an Omniscience online. So maybe it's good, maybe it's not. Definitely needs more testing. But with that, we are on to Brewer's Corner, favorite segment every week. Let's go ahead and get things kicked off, Max. Tell us about Rakdos Lizards.
All right, the Lizard's back. Credit to Splash for fixing a Rebel Guild Mage, for bringing this back and bringing up this iteration. What we have here is basically a low curve deck with some tech that allows it to go further, whether it's extending damage or getting a little bit of card advantage. I have to say first, right off the rip, Alicia is a one of spicy, reanimating your creatures every time she attacks with bonuses for playing lizards and extra damage in the deck. This can be devastating, by turn 3 or early in the match. Painter Studio Deface Gallery gives you access to more cards initially, and then makes your creatures more lethal, which, you're already doing damage just for casting lizards in a lot of cases, so that damage piles up over time, and that's what this deck does best. I love Nemesis. I'll say it again. It presents an issue for the Mono Red, for the mid-range matchups. It's a wonderful blocker, a wonderful attacker. I think it's just a really good versatile card. I will note Soul Cauldron in the sideboard, really a response to the graveyard decks while also giving a bonus to your creatures. And I also have to point out a card that we don't often see, Caught in the Crossfire. Spicy card is a 2 of in the sideboard, as there are plenty of Warlocks and Mercenaries in the deck that get around it.
Yeah, you're not lying. And this is such a fascinating build. Prior to this, every Lizards build you felt like you played, it felt like they were going to be dead to Wrath effects. And this is the first build I looked at, and I'm like, Alicia, ooh, nice. Like, card advantage on Painter Studio. Okay, we can grind. So I like that this is a build that can actually grind for the first time instead of relying on getting there before that first split up is cast and blows you out of the water.
Oh yeah.
But with that, we're going to move on to the second one here, Bant Toxic. Now, this one is by Arcani1. Got second in an MTGO challenge on Saturday, losing to Pixies in the finals. That's right, made it all the way to the finals before it lost, and I think you can start to see why. Because Bounce decks versus Venerated Rot Priest, not the best moment for them. Don't really want to bounce this, kind of have to kill it, and you have to do it through Skrelves. You just got to keep pushing, right? And they have their own. This town ain't big enough, so if you try to kill it, maybe just take a poison, maybe take 2 poison anyway. I just keep it. It's kind of wild that this town ain't big enough is so good that it's getting shoved into toxic decks, but here we are. And noting there's Wilt Leaf Leeches just sitting in the sideboard for this too. This player was ready for Dimir Bounce and Esper Pixies. I don't know how they lost the finals. Maybe, they just got a rough draw. But this deck feels like it is just primed to prey on all of those decks. And I can't wait to mess with it some more, especially because Spirit's Ascent, what a great way to deal with nowhere to run. Just, they cast it, well, doesn't matter. It's too big for that, and it's got Flying and Toxic. That's quite the combo right there. Love what they're doing there. Props to Arcani1. That is a spicy build, and we are here for it.
Oh, yeah. I ran into this on ladder last night, and I was like, what the heck? Why is Bant Toxic seeing play again? And then I instantly knew the changes when I tried to, hit one of their Rot Priests with a Carnosaur, and they boosted it, and I was like, oh, okay. So you're making it hard to target these creatures, and I'm still getting poison counters. So that's, I could see how this deck would be strong right now.
Just going right under everybody, and they're like, oh, we're low to the ground. And you're like, not as low as Toxic. Not as low as Toxic. nothing but 1 drops, baby. Let's go. Anyway, we're going to move it right along. The third deck, Jurassic Beatdown. Let's do it.
Woo! Let's go. Credit to the Rebellion Discord, our guild mages coming together to put this together and test it out and see how we can build it. We began with the full set of 12 mana dorks, and downsized it to 9 with this iteration. I think there's room to do that, especially with those 2-drop Paleontologists. But replacing that with 3 Torch Towers, taking that spot, gives us more interaction early on, which is, I think, what this deck needed. It just, at first didn't interact at an early, part of the game. Ramping up to Rampaging Raptor on 3 feels really great versus Dimir Tempo, especially with Kaido running around. So don't sleep on that card. And then the classic playing Yearling into Hammer Skull, decent damage output early on. A lot of board states aren't ready for that 6 damage on that turn. And then, of course, Dracosaur is here because it's a must-kill threat. You know, by the time you get to Dracosaur, they've already, you know, dinged your, you know, bolted the birds, you know, dinged your smaller creatures, and they're not ready for it. And if they don't kill it on the spot, that becomes huge advantage for you. So I love that card. And I just want to point out real quick that the 6-drop dinosaur gives you value, being able to discover 5. You know, sure, bounce it. I'll play it again. So no one really expects the Dino Beatdown deck, and we're here for it, especially since we're getting a new Dino in the next set with Regal Imperiosaur, which is a 3-drop 5/4 that comes with an Anthem effect. I love this card. The idea of pushing this card into a Gruul Dinos deck really excites me. So that should be up on the screen now. Y'all check that out.
Yeah, I cannot wait to replace Belligerent Yearling with that 5/4 the Dino Lord. Like, the deck gets so much better when you get into that. Belligerent Yearling's a placeholder, and it's not terrible, folks.
Yeah.
We're doing just fine with it on the ladder, but it's going to be a whole different world when you have really good 3-drops to ramp into basically every hand off of those Llanowar Elves and Ixali's Lorekeeper. So I'm excited to see where the deck develops. It's probably not going to be tier 1, let's be honest, but it could be well positioned for a weekend, and beating everybody with dinosaurs is, you know, little extra props.
Pretty fun.
So let's go take a look at a deck that inspires no joy for anyone else. Dimir Control. All right, shout out to Athena the Bun, Rebellion Coach. Yeah, and this is her latest brew. So we've got all the Wrath effects, all the draw effects, almost no win cons. You've probably played against Control at some point in your life, and if you haven't, well, get ready. It's going to happen at some point. This deck does all of that and more. Really, the core of this deck is saying we're not going to interact. All those nowhere to runs, all that removal, we don't care. None of it matters to us whatsoever. And by the way, our Wraths have Cranial Extraction, which pretty effective when most decks only have a couple ways that they're really trying to push through, and you just remove them, you know? Like, some decks, especially Domain, start to fall apart once you just take a couple of the Overlords or the Zers out. There's just not that much they can do anymore. And this deck, between these 3 and the end, 4 Cranials in the main. So I don't know exactly how many Jaces are correct for this list. I think 1 in the main makes a lot of sense as an alt-win con. I don't know if you need more in the board or if these outrageous robberies continue. But I love where it's positioned. I love that she picked Get Out as a 2 of counterspell, because hard counter for creatures and enchantments. Huge right now with how many enchantments are running around.
Yeah, no one's running Cavern right now, just because nobody's running Control. So I think it's a perfect time for this archetype to come back.
Absolutely. And that's going to bring us to our final segment, Ahead of the Curve. Now, Max, we've looked at 12 archetypes going in our recap, and what are you playing going into week 12 of Foundation Standard? That's the final week before we get Fast and the Furious Aetherdrift. What are we doing?
I better have some fun with it while I can, so I'm going to be playing Rakdos Reanimator. I just have to point out, graveyard play is very viable right now, and this deck also has a game plan B for that. So, you know, the major play that you want to get to is push-pull, bringing back a Terror of the Peaks and a Coma at the same time. If they have haste, you know, you get those 4/3/3s, and that damage just goes straight to face. So I love the combination of Terror with Coma being the 2 cards that you bring back. Valgavoth is also here, very strong when you aren't dealing with board wipes, which, you know, a few of the tier 1 decks aren't playing board wipes, so you might as well try it. And then in case of the Graveyard Exile, right, we anticipate Rest in Peace, the Black Leyline. We have 2 copies of Ashiok in the sideboard, which if you get those Nightmare tokens out right away, they become stronger and stronger the more that, you know, cards are exiled. So I like the idea of pushing in Ashiok, anticipating that game plan. I think 3 Duresses in the main is a must for any combo deck, any Reanimator deck currently. There's just too much going on in the meta to disrupt you. Another plan B is Bitter Reunion into Cruel Claw. It allows you to play some of your more expensive cards right off the rip. And I just want to point out, because I've been asked, Molten Collapse in the sideboard, you can kill a creature and you can take out a Ghost Vacuum all in one play. So that's why I like that card.
I can tell you that this already has my heart, because I managed the top 4 of a Legacy 1K over the weekend as well with Rakdos Reanimator, and yeah, part of me just wants to play more Reanimator. That deck was so much fun, Max. I was doing turn 1, draw 21 cards, deal 25 damage. It was insane. God, I wish I could play that in Standard. Anyway.
That sounds fun.
Right. Since Arena doesn't let us play Legacy yet, boo Wizards. Let's get on to the standard deck I've got queued up. Selesnya Cage, yet again. Alrighty, folks. So this is, I think, the last week this deck will honestly be viable. Once people really flip into temporary lockdowns everywhere, this gets a lot harder. Aetherdrift obviously is going to shake things up as well. And as I've noted before, this isn't really a Tier 1 deck. This is a Tier 1.5 deck that is designed to beat up on the Tier 1 decks. But if those decks change, so does this deck's viability. That said, we get one more week of competitive RCQs before Aetherdrift, right? So let's look at why we're doing it this way. Sheltered by Ghosts, I still like the split. Enduring Innocence, we got one copy in the main over the second Malira. I think that's correct. The second Malira was pretty awkward at times. We have another copy of Enduring Innocence here, but we did not go to the full 3 or 4. We brought back some Paw Patch formations. There were a couple scenarios, especially against Domain and the Swiss, where we just needed a little bit more enchantment removal for the leyline bindings and a few other pieces like Overlords that are in the way. So I think it's worth that. Again, we're getting to the point where we're just tuning the slots down to the last iota, right? And that's about where this list is. There's some new cards coming in that are going to be interesting for this, but nothing that looks like it's going to take it over the top. So again, this list is there because you want to beat up on Dimir Bounce, Esper Pixie, Gruul Aggro, Mono Red. That's what it's there for. That's what it does. If you think you're going to see a lot of that this weekend, and you probably should, this is your deck. If you think you're going to see control, for the love of God, don't take this deck.
I just love that we're in a standard meta where no one deck really is fully dominant. Like they share a portion of the pie of the meta, and they're able to beat a portion of the decks out there, but no one deck is beating everything. And I think that's as much as we could ask for from standard. But look, I just want to say thank you for watching till the end. We really appreciate your support. I had a great time this past week chatting with G Funky on the Rebelcast with Athena the Bun. We discussed our first Rebellion event at Spotlight Atlanta. Go check out that Rebelcast if you haven't already on YouTube or Spotify. We plan on having another one next week with, possibly an exciting announcement. I won't give away here, but Figured Base is going to be our special guest, her return to the Rebelcast. I do promise it'll be a lot of fun, so you won't want to miss it.
Hashtag bounce time. Last but not least, please like, share, comment on this video, show some support for this community. We appreciate having all of you here. It means the world to us that you're still around. And until next time, untap, upkeep, resist.